People who didn't lose their lives on this day but lost their lives 63 years ago this past June. This is a story that's it's really the collision between the past and the present. There's a lot of writers who tell the tale of non-fiction stories. One that comes to mind that I enjoyed that took place not too far from here, the story about the Bath Massacre. That was a nonfiction book written several years ago, a terrible tragedy that happened in our state. But the difference here with this, telling this story and having written this book, is that things changed essentially because of us meddling in the past. And I hope that meddling, we were just talking about that, I hope that meddling is for good. But it's really a collision between the past and the present. So I want to share with you some things about both the past and the activities that we've been doing in the present. And I'm going to get this started with a little bit of a film clip here. And we're going to take us back in time to 1950. The war had ended just 5 years earlier. The economy was on the rise.
For $100 down payment, ordinary Americans could buy into a new way of life.
The perfect little house, and it came with a refrigerator, and a stove, and a washing machine.
The baby boom was on. 1/4 of the population owned automobiles. And airways crisscrossed the country. Families gathered around the radio, and ladies swooned over the Ames brothers. The theme song from this theatrical release made the #1 hit song in June 1950. And those who could afford a television set watched. These idyllic times were colored only by the Red Scare. On a balmy Friday night in late June, 58 people gathered at New York's LaGuardia Airport. Captain Robert Lind and First Officer Vern Wolfe entered flight control at LaGuardia to review their flight plan. They would be flying to Minneapolis, Minnesota, and from there a fresh crew would continue on to Spokane and Seattle. Checking in with Northwest meteorologists, they learned that a squall line had developed and was headed east towards Lake Michigan. They would have to approach that storm with caution. Then they headed out to the tarmac to check out the airplane. Their knowledge of aircraft would have told them that this plane was built as a C-54, the military equivalent of a DC-4. That aft cargo door gave it away. The plane had been built at the start of World War II by the McDonnell Douglas Company. This plane was the first C-54 to roll off the production line at Orchard Field, which is today the site of one of the world's busiest airports, O'Hare. They gathered in the cockpit to go over the last-minute checklist. And while they did that, the baggage was loaded. And then the passengers boarded the plane. And then the process of starting the engines began, one after another. At 8:31, Flight 2501 headed down the runway and then took off, heading into the setting sun. The pilots would be flying on the beam that night. That meant that they were listening to audio tones in their headsets to guide them from checkpoint to checkpoint. Over every major city on the route, they radioed a Northwest operator to report their position and estimate their next checklist. Stewardess Bonnie Ann Feldman was in the compartment taking care of the passengers, identified as 27 women, 22 men, and 6 children. As the plane passed over Battle Creek, Michigan at 11:51, it entered the storm front. Captain Robert Lind radioed the operator at the Willow Run Airport that he expected to reach Milwaukee at 11:37 Central Standard Time. And as the plane passed the lakeshore, it was flying at 3,500 feet. At 13 minutes past midnight, Captain Lind initiated a radio contact. That was the last communication from Flight 2501. By dawn's light, it became clear that the plane had gone down in the waters of Lake Michigan. The next morning, the local newspapers reported the tragedy. This was the worst aviation disaster in the country at the time. Northwest Airlines asked the Navy and the Coast Guard to direct 5 major vessels out into Lake Michigan to begin the search. This was intended to be a search and rescue mission. And Commander Frederick Gettle, only 39 years old at the time, was put in charge of the whole operation. Under him would be serving Larry Otto as an ensign. This was Larry's second day on the job, and he was going off on a major search and recovery operation. This was and still is the largest such operation on the Great Lakes. Those 2 men were stationed on the Woodbine. There were 3 other Coast Guard vessels and a Navy destroyer that were called in to do this search work. And for all day Saturday and most of Sunday, they combed the waters of Lake Michigan, beginning over by Milwaukee. It was presumed that the plane had made it that far, but they found nothing. And then Sunday night at about 6 o'clock in the late afternoon, Captain Julius Allers of the LCJ fishing tug, the LCJ, mind you, is still in South Haven operating to this day. Captain Allers went out to recover nets that he had set the prior Friday. And he recovered those nets, and there were a lot of whitefish in the nets, but he found something else, something that didn't look like fish. He was pretty sure he was looking at human flesh. He knew in an instant that the plane had not gone down over by Milwaukee, that in fact it was somewhere closer to South Haven. He began hauling in the rest of the net and recovered something else. There was a suitcase tangled in that net, and when he opened it up, there were several ties. There was even a shirt inside that suitcase. This is the very shirt that he recovered. His daughter has passed it on to me now as the caretaker of that shirt. An amazing artifact. They hurried back into South Haven to report their discovery to the local authorities. And then about 2 hours later, South Haven's Coast Guard sent out a small boat, and they came upon a huge field of debris about 12 miles off South Haven. They found blankets that were stamped with the name Northwest, and that confirmed that this in fact was the site of the tragedy. All the other vessels were then redirected from the different places they were in the lake over to South Haven, and they began recovering those items from the lake bottom. They also sent the Navy vessel to start looking with their sonar to try to find the wreckage on the bottom of the lake. But let's watch what their recovery was like. This is real footage.
Aboard a Northwest Airlines. It crashed a few miles offshore in Lake Michigan on a routine flight from New York to Minneapolis. The cause of the catastrophe, unknown.
Imagine that right here in Lake Michigan. Well, for Larry Otto, this was it was an exciting time when they headed out. He thought that they would possibly be recovering people, rescuing people from the waters. Some 60 years later, when I spoke with him, he indicated that his biggest disappointment was there was nobody alive to rescue. This became simply search and recovery. It traumatized him for quite some time. Now, what the Coast Guard couldn't recover from the waters ended up drifting to shore, most of it right at South Haven or just a little bit north and south of South Haven. And you can imagine what that was like, particularly for the city of South Haven, which, like today, back then, this was a tourist town. This accident happened just days before the 4th of July holiday, and some 10,000 people were on their way to South Haven to enjoy the sun and the beaches. Well, the Mayor Tate at the time, ended up making a tough decision. He had to close the beaches. He didn't think it would be conducive to the local economy if the tourists encountered human remains on the beach. Now for John Fleming, who was the county coroner, this became a mission that would last for several days. He was deployed to the beach to start recovering human remains. He left the other debris to the Coast Guard, who had put together a mounted group so that they could cover the beach. Now I want to share with you what John Fleming encountered on one of his trips down the beach in a Jeep. This was just south of South Haven, and a woman flagged him down and said, "Are you in charge here?" "Well, ma'am," he said, introducing himself, "I'm one of the people in charge. I'm collecting human remains." "Oh, what a tragedy," she responded, shaking her head and closing her eyes for a moment. "My son found something and I didn't know what to do with it, so I put it in my refrigerator." "I'd be happy to take that off your hands, ma'am." "Give me a couple of minutes," she said, retreating back up the incline towards a sizable-sized home. She returned shortly with a brown paper bag. "I don't know what this is," she said, handing it to him. Fleming opened the top of the bag and peered inside. "Ma'am, this is a human lung," he said. That was the kind of things that people were finding on the beach. This was a horrible period of time. The newspapers in South Haven, in Kalamazoo, and around the country were reporting the goings-on out there, what was being recovered. They were also reporting the search effort, which after 3 days, the Navy had not been able to find any evidence of the wreck on the bottom of the lake. Now, you see the headline here, the search has ended. They only spent 5 days looking for the remains of the plane, recovering debris from the lake, and then the search was over. All these vessels were sent back to their home port, and you can see that something else was making the headlines right about that time. We were at war once again, just 5 years after the World War II ended. Well, it would be 6 months before the Civil Aeronautics Board, now that's the equivalent of the modern day NTSB, the board wrote a report about the accident. It was only 4 pages long, about 6,000 words. There wasn't much to it. Today's reports are hundreds of pages in length. And the conclusion of that report was there was not enough evidence to make any determination what caused the plane to crash. And that was it. 58 people's lives were, their loss of their lives was unexplained. And a quarter century passed, and at that time, Northwest was already flying jets. And in 1977, the first write-up about this accident took place in this book. And let me tell you, it was not the kind of write-up that I've tackled now 63 years after the accident. This author blamed the loss of Flight 2501 on twinkling lights in the sky. You can imagine what he was getting at. Years later, this plane loss was attributed to the Michigan Triangle. There's another writer that writes about that. I'm a little bit more realistic. These are dangerous lakes and dangerous skies. I don't think there was anything mystical about this accident. But time passed. Now it's over a half century since this accident occurred, since these people lost their lives. And at that time, my organization, Michigan Shipwreck Research Associates, we were just fresh from our discovery of the first shipwreck we found. It was the H.C. Akeley, a steamer lost in 1883. We found the remains off Saugatuck, Michigan, and what we saw on the bottom really helped write the final story of what happened to that steamer. I won't go into that whole story, but suffice it to say that to find the physical remains of a lost accident was very eye-opening. And it was about that time that my husband Jack and our partner Craig Rich in the white got to talking about Flight 2501. We didn't so much think about searching for it, but we wanted to be aware of what happened because we thought in the course of searching for other lost shipwrecks, we might in fact encounter the remains of the airplane. Now, Craig and I and Jack had started our organization a few years before 2001. We're all divers, we're all historians, we've become writers over the years, and we wanted to find the remains of a number of ships lost in our region so that we could write, so to speak, the final chapter and interpret our rich maritime history using these underwater resources to tell those stories. Well, Craig penned an anniversary article for the South Haven Tribune in 2003, and that went far and wide, and somebody in Arizona saw that article. Now, we're in a library. I hope you recognize this man. Clive Cussler, the Clive Cussler. I meant to count it up. He has so many books now I can't keep track. It's at least over 50 books, and most of you know these are nonfiction adventure novels. In his first series, Dirk Pitt was that dreamy, green-eyed adventure hero who saved the world from utter destruction on a number of occasions. And most of the time he had to go underwater to do it. So the character became my hero. But when I learned that Clive Cussler also wrote nonfiction books, 2 of them in particular about his own adventures to solve some of the world's most mysterious lost vessel incidents, then I became a fan of the writer, not so much his characters. Now, Cussler is known in shipwreck circles, probably best known for his discovery of the Horace L. Hunley. This was the first submarine to ever sink an enemy vessel during battle. The enemy was us, the North, and this humble little submarine sunk the Housatonic during the Civil War. Well, Clive found that wreck, and it was just a few years after his discovery of the Hunley that he proposed a joint venture between our team and his team, the real-life National Underwater Marine Agency. And so in 2004, the partnership began. What we agreed to do is our team would be involved in the research. We would determine where to search, and then Clive would supply the sonar operators who would search for the remains of the plane. Well, he decided to send Ralph Wilbanks to West Michigan. Ralph is the man who found the Hunley. So this was a real exciting time for us to have Ralph coming to West Michigan. Ralph brought his side scan sonar gear and he installed it on our boat, and then the search began in 2004. We decided to begin the search where the accident report indicated the plane had crashed. Now, they never found the remains, so I don't know how they could be so specific to say that it went down 18 miles northwest of Benton Harbor, but at that point we had nothing else to go on, so we began the search there. It took some hour and a half to get out to the site before we slowed down, put the sonar in the water. You also saw a magnetometer going in the water as well to see if there's any metal down there. Attaching weights to the line because we're dropping this sonar about 250 feet into the water. We actually have to deploy about 600 feet of cable to get the sonar down 200 or 250 feet. And so there's Ralph letting the cable out. Steve Howard, his boat pilot, is coming around to begin his lanes. The lanes we set are like mowing the lawn, back and forth very slowly to make sure we have full coverage. And then securing the sonar in place, and then retreating into the cabin to wait for a target to show up. Well, we weren't looking for a DC-4 like this on the bottom of the lake. We knew from that accident report that we were looking for a debris field, bits and pieces of that plane. Now, the first year that they were here, we were able to cover this area off South Haven, about 10 square miles, and we found a lot of sand out there. There was no airplane wreckage. So we retreated to the archives to spend the winter doing more research to try to pin down a better location for that accident. We were able to uncover the Coast Guard and the Navy logbooks, which gave hour-by-hour reports of what was happening out on that lake in June 1950. And those reports even provided latitude and longitude coordinates for where a lot of the debris had been found. Well, we plotted that debris, the debris found out in the lake and the debris that had come to shore both north and south of South Haven. And that gave us a better idea where to begin the search. We also got our hands on a 1949 aeronautical chart of Lake Michigan, and we learned that Flight 2501 was scheduled to fly on an airway called Red 57. These were like highways in the sky, but that report also indicated that that last call that the captain had placed was when the plane was in the vicinity of Benton Harbor, which was significantly south of this corridor. That place at Benton Harbor was actually on the east end of a different airway, Red 28, that ran from Benton Harbor to Chicago. But interestingly, all the debris, all those dots that you saw on the map, had been found between those two corridors. So we wondered if the pilot had decided to reroute his plane, perhaps around the storm, or whether the storm blew him off course. Well, what we did with the information that we gathered is we started working with a division in the Coast Guard and a division in Ann Arbor, the Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab. They employ scientists whose job it is to study the currents and the way things drift in water. Because if we could apply what's called hindcasting, we might be able to determine, based on where we knew the debris was found out in the lake and on shore, we could potentially determine a place where that plane had gone down in order to then distribute that. It's, as I said, called hindcasting. So we were able to define, with the scientists' help, a circle. This is 25 miles in diameter, where the scientists agreed that we should find the wreckage somewhere within that circle. Now, something else that we discovered doing our research was an incredible discovery: 5,000 pages of court transcripts. As it turns out, there were 4 families who chose not to settle with the airline, but instead wanted to prove that the airline had been negligent in this accident. Well, in addition to reading the testimony of about 25 different people, we learned about the plane, we learned about the flight, we learned about the aftermath, all the things recovered from the lake. It was very, very eye-opening, but unfortunately, there were not a set of coordinates in the transcripts that told us where the plane went down. Quite a bit of information, but not what we were looking for. But armed now with all that new research, new insights into the flight, the NUMA team returned in 2005. We began covering more and more territory. We worked for about a month in the spring of 2005. We were able to accomplish about another 30 square miles. And at that point, 2 expeditions into our mission, we were starting to get some press coverage. Now, the author referred to here is not me, that's Clive Cussler. I had not yet written my first book at this time, but the press coverage was reaching out far and wide. I also started doing programs like this to share with the public what was going on. And at one program in 2005, I had a revelation. Now, usually we presenters have some kind of an idea of what we're going to say to the audiences. Even though I'm ad-libbing tonight, I know what I'm going to say. But that particular night, something popped into my head. It just occurred to me. I had about 300 people in the audience, and I just blurted out what I was thinking. I said, you know, this didn't happen that long ago, that there might not be people still alive who knew somebody on this. We were so used to dealing with shipwrecks that had gone down 100, 150 years ago that was never a possibility. But I blurted that out, and then without saying anything, I wondered how those people would feel about what we were doing. Would we be trespassing on their emotional territory? Well, it was almost prophetic that I had said that, because literally 2 weeks later, this popped into my inbox in my email from Kenneth Skog. My goodness, I thought, that's the name of a victim. I thought, did somebody live? Did he live? Was he still alive? Is he contacting me? I couldn't click on that email fast enough, and I very soon found out that I was getting an email from the grandson of the victim, also named Ken Skog. Well, he shared a lot of details about the accident that I didn't know, and within a couple of weeks, my husband Jack and I were over in Detroit, meeting not only with the grandson, but with his father and with his son, all named Kenneth Skog after the patriarch in the family. They're certainly keeping his memory alive. That was a very hard meeting. They were very warm and friendly and very curious, but the son in particular was still very troubled over this accident. One of the things that had haunted him is he drove his father to the airport that night in New York, and they'd had an argument over an automobile repair bill, $7.50. The son didn't want to pay the bill. They argued about that, and he has taken that with him all these years, still haunting him that was the last conversation he had with his father. Well, it was a hard conversation for me to have, to dredge up those old memories. I'm a shipwreck hunter and a diver. I'm not a grief counselor. And so when another email popped in from a William Kaufman, I also recognized the name Kaufman from the list of victims, I didn't want to respond. I literally sat on that email for about 6 months. And then I started feeling guilty, and I picked up the phone, and I took a deep breath, and I called Bill Kaufman. And boy, was that conversation difficult, even more so than with the Skogs. I want to read you a little bit of our conversation, which Bill ended up writing, transcribing for the foreword of my book. He said, "We and the others left behind were among the victims of that plane crash. I'd never experienced losing someone. There was no casket to look into. Worse, I was not even allowed to attend my mother's memorial service. Her loss was so jarring. Starting far too young, I began thinking about philosophy. I read a lot, but there were no answers to questions like, why did this happen to me? What did I do to deserve this fate? Is there really a God? When I couldn't come up with those answers, I started posing simpler questions like, what happened to the plane? Did my mother suffer? Whose fault was it? But the crash had by then become a mystery that took its rank among a score of other strange disappearances. Eventually, I found happiness again. All the same, even after all these years since I lost my mother on that plane, I would still like to know what happened." And that's the thoughts that Bill Kaufman left me in that first phone call. And at that point, the conversations that I had had with those two families changed this whole effort for me. I had a new awareness that these were all real people. They had hopes, they had dreams, they had families who loved them. This was no longer just an effort to solve a historical mystery. This was an effort to provide closure for those families. And so we felt it rather an obligation a couple months later to invite the Kaufmans and the Skogs to Lake Michigan. And we gave Bill Kaufman that memorial service for his mother that he had never had. We had that service out on the lake while the search effort was going on. We learned that Bill had had a little sister, 2 years old at the time of the loss, and there's the Skog men. Well, Bill was very happy to meet the Skog family, share stories of the aftermath of that disaster. He was comforted in knowing that he didn't go through this alone, that there were other people. But on that day, out on the lake, after that memorial service, he challenged me. He said, I want to find other families. I want to see how they coped with this. And so that became a new mission, not only to try to find the plane, but to try to find more people. And now the tables had been turned. I was no longer waiting for calls from these people. I was looking for them. And so I became sort of a detective, a genealogist. The telephone and the internet became the tools of choice that I used over the next 4 years. I began with the more complex names, Rorabau or Surbu, and I knew that it was going to be very hard to find names like Frost or Reed. They were just so common. But over the next 4 years, I did find them. Here I am with the co-pilot's wife and his sister, 101 years old at the time. She drove herself to our meeting in Wisconsin. Well, over time, I found 50 of the 58 people, and I learned little things about them, and I want to introduce you to them. Captain Robert Lind. He'd been with Northwest 9 years. He flew during the war effort for Northwest, but it took him 4 times to pass his flight exams, both written and flight. Here's Vern Wolf, the co-pilot. He hadn't been with Northwest that long, but he had passed his tests with flying colors. I think he may well have been more of the intuitive pilot of the two. Bonnie Ann Feldman, she wasn't supposed to be on that flight. She was feeling sick. She traded with another stewardess. That's how she got herself on Flight 2501. The Adjemians, this is their 40th wedding anniversary picture. They were both in their 60s. They were heading to Seattle to visit her sister and have a summer holiday. Benjamin and Slava Houston. Benjamin had just found out that he had prostate cancer. He didn't know that he had long to live, or he knew that he didn't have long to live, but certainly he didn't expect to die on this trip. Arthur and Geraldine Jackson, they were traveling to Minneapolis to share the good news with his family that Geraldine was pregnant. Carl and Louise Schlachter, they were so in love. He was being transferred, an architect being transferred to Seattle. They were so in love, they signed their name Carl Lou as if they were one. The Frings, William and Rosa Fring, perhaps, in fact, I think, the most well-to-do people on the plane. He was a vice president and attorney for ITT Corporation, yet they were still humble enough to fly a coach. This was a coach flight. Their daughter, Barbara, 17 years old, this would be her last trip with the family. She was expecting a proposal from her boyfriend sometime that year. Leo Waller, he was leaving 7 children behind at home in Billings, Montana. Dr. Cardle, 2 children and a wife. He was coming back from a medical convention in Canada, coming through New York. One of his co-workers was nice enough to trade airline tickets so the doctor could get home earlier. Merle Barton, a hairstylist, he had been in New York learning some new techniques and was going to bring that back to his beauty salon in Billings. And then this is Joseph Serbu. He was a buyer. There was a buying a week in New York for clothing representatives. He purchased a mink stole for his wife, shipped it home. She received it a week after he died. Rosalie Gorski, she was returning from spending time with her family. She was so excited to be telling her husband for the first time when she got off the plane that she was pregnant. Her husband would die without ever knowing that he'd lost both a wife and a child. Heading up the single men was Reverend Augustine Walsh, taking on a new church assignment in Minneapolis. This is Ralph Olson, who was going to a church convention to meet his parents in Minneapolis. Neil Goldsberry, who was planning to propose to his girlfriend, and Mary Keating, who was going to meet her fiance's family for the first time. This was, oh gosh, I'm forgetting her name, Ellen Ross, a nurse. She planned this trip so that she would make her boyfriend's heart grow fonder with her absence. She was hoping to get a proposal when she returned. Joe Longfield, another buyer, 38 years old, not married. Louise Spohn, a Christian Scientist who was going to a religious convention in Minneapolis. She was hoping to meet a young boy who shared her religion. And this is Frank Schwartz, who was on his way to his daughter's wedding. She would be married the next day and he would be giving her away. He packed 2 cases of champagne in the plane for the celebration. And the oldest passenger on board, Marie Rohrabau, going to spend the summer with her daughter, who was expecting her 3rd child that summer. The Hawkinson family, perhaps the most tragic of all the people on the plane, an entire family. Little Janice, 7 years old, and Tommy, 5. They were going, like 2 of the other women passengers, to share the news that Kay was pregnant with her 3rd child. Well, after gathering all that information, understanding the plane, the route, getting to know the people that were on board this, it made the search effort all the more important for us. We began building on prior coverage, each year returning, being able to cover about 30 to 40 square miles per year, not finding Flight 2501, but finding a lot of other things. We found the aft half of this car ferry, the Ann Arbor No. 5, plunge steeply into the bottom. Historic records indicate that it was scrapped, but in fact we learned the story that it was being taken to the scrap yard when a piece of it got away, plunged to the bottom in 160 feet of water. We also found this vessel, the Hennepin. Did not know about it until we found it. We learned that it was the world's first self-unloading vessel. It changed what we knew about the transportation industry on the Great Lakes. We actually nominated this to the National Register of Historic Places. I wrote my 2nd book on this topic. I always had in mind to write about the plane, but without finding that, I ended up writing about other boats. And then one year, about 3-4 years into the search, Clive decided to join us. Prior to this, he was sending Ralph and the team, but he came himself, and well, he brought some good luck. And let's hear about the good luck from Clive himself. This is the boat. By now they were bringing their own boat instead of using ours. So this is the same boat that found the Hunley. There's Clive returning from the 2nd day of searching.
Hey, Jesse, luck today? So when you first saw things on the screen, what were you thinking? Look. Were you thinking 2501 or?
No, that was wrong, the shipwreck. found the one that I guess is possibly a schooner or something. And as we came down, we found another what we thought was a section of it, just way out on the edge of the lake. No, it's very far.
I was going to ask Clive, is this the first time you've been out searching Lake Michigan?
They went out the other day.
Hey, no, I haven't been up Michigan before.
So how does this compare to, say, the North Sea for you?
It was pretty calm today. It was like a beer out there.
Don't think that's normal, though.
Yeah, Ralph will tell you, there's a few bad days out there too. Maybe not.
They're both a bunch of jokers. Well, Clive being in town really changed things up. There were quite a few discoveries. We found the Hattie Wells that year. This was a 200-foot-long schooner that had gone down carrying lumber to St. Joseph. We found the Joseph P. Fernan, a wooden steamer that burned about 20 miles off South Haven. There's not much left of that wreck. We found what we believe is the A.P. Dutton, a small schooner that had been carrying schoolhouse furniture to Michigan in 1868, and now the William Tell, that also burned off Benton Harbor, and that had gone down in 1869. We also found what we think is the oldest vessel in our waters. We believe this dates back to being constructed in 1840, possibly lost in 1850, if it's the Buffalo, as we suspect it is. We found a small barge that was a victim of vandalism in the 70s. We found an anchor. We found a gill net from a fisherman. We found 2 buoys that had been lost off Coast Guard tender. We even found a site that fooled us into thinking we'd found the airplane. It was most certainly not the airplane. We found everything. I think in this debris field we even found a kitchen sink. So we're finding everything out there. But we found something that's significantly more important, and we found this on land, not out in the water. We found a notation in the register at the Riverview Cemetery in St. Joseph that unknown parts of bodies from the plane wreck had been buried there. I went to the site and was dismayed to see that it was simply grass. The remains of 58 people are there, but there was nothing to mark their passing. So we began thinking about what to do to change that, and so let's watch what happened. I don't know why this is not working. Well, I'm going to have to add, well, boy, doggone it, I want you to see this. I don't think I'm going to be able to do it. He is talking, this was a newscast in 2008. He's talking about the plane. He's giving a little bit of background. I'm very sorry the sound isn't working. Now I'm talking, much like I'm talking today, talking about the search. But what I want you to see is that what we were able to do is get a marker put there, thanks to the Philbrant Funeral Home in South Haven donated a granite memorial. We hosted a memorial service. We had families come from 12 different states. About 15 people came. We had a service to honor these people that were lost, and it really provided a good deal of closure for all the people that could be there. It was a beautiful day in September. All 7 of Leo Waller's children were there. That was the largest family loss. It was really a monumental occasion, I think, for these families and for all the families that couldn't make the trip. Many people by then were seniors, but they were there with us in spirit. There's the memorial that's obviously marking that site today. Now let's fast forward to 2013, this year. We completed all of the area in the circle that we believe the plane might be located in. If you're wondering about this area, we left it undone simply because it's just too close to shore to have been where the plane went down. It's hard to fathom that the scientists' calculations were that wrong, but we did not find anything having to do with the plane there. I had to ask myself, is it possible that we missed the plane? but I'm reminded that when Ralph is using his sonar equipment, he is able to create a video mosaic linking all of the lanes that he runs. You remember me talking about this being like mowing the lawn. He can link them together. We know everything that he's found, and we know that there are no holes out there. One thing that we had to consider, this is one of the ships that we found, and you see how it's really sort of deeply embedded into the lake bottom. We had to start considering that it's possible that the remains of the plane could have settled into the bottom. You remember the Ann Arbor 5, something is holding that on a 45-degree angle in the lake bottom. And also the AP Dunton is settled very deeply into the bottom muck. So that worries me, it concerns me that perhaps the airplane remains have settled in. But I also have to consider that maybe the plane is just a little bit outside of that circle that the scientists have calculated. But now, crazy that I have dog pictures here. I want to read you a little section from the book, because at the end of our search this past summer, we ended in May, I had another revelation. This was our 10th year of searching, and I pictured our team as a pack of bloodhounds with our noses to the ground, sniffing out a trail to the plane. Every so often the scent changed directions, and we turned and we followed it, and we never once stopped to take a fresh breath of air and look around. And that vision actually forced me to take that stop, take that breath, and look around. When I did, I realized that we had lost sight of the goal. For me, the goal had been to solve the mystery of the crash. Finding the wreck had only been the objective that I thought was critical to achieving the goal. I finally came to the conclusion that even if we did find the wreck, that alone would only provide an X to mark the spot of the accident. After more than 6 decades underwater, the wreckage would be in no condition to determine why the plane crashed. I finally realized that the answers about what happened to Flight 2501 do not lay on the bottom of Lake Michigan. They lay in our research. I thought about what Clive Cussler has said to us. A wreck will only be found when it wants to be found. I don't think Flight 2501 wanted to be found. Instead, I think it wanted us to learn about the plane, the flight, the crew, the passengers, the search and recovery operation, the wrongful death suit, and find the grave site. All things we could not possibly learn from finding the wreckage on the lake bottom. Only then could we conclude with a reasonable degree of certainty the reasons for this tragic accident. And let me share with you some thoughts about that accident now with the perspective of 10 years of research. The accident was like a chain of events. And I detail a lot of those events, but one too many of those events is what caused the plane to crash. Now, what we know from historical records is that Robert Lind, the pilot, was informed of a squall line that had been developing and was heading east towards Lake Michigan, towards his flight path. What we know from the very next day's weather, and this is in the national weather charts, this was printed in every newspaper in the country. This chart was created at midnight based on the current conditions, and you can see that that squall line changed direction. It was now heading south. It was at about 100 miles an hour velocity. And when I lay over this chart, those two corridors that the plane may have been flying on, I think the reason for this accident will become clear. No matter which path that pilot took, he was caught in the middle of that storm, and Northwest didn't inform him of those changing conditions. What we also know from talking to this man, Joseph Kim, who was the chief pilot for Northwest at the time, we know that he came to some conclusions back then that he could not talk about, but now not hampered by bureaucracy. 60 some odd years later, when Joe Kim was in his late 90s, he did provide his theory, and this is based on a man who saw the remains of that plane. And Joe Kim believed that Flight 2501 experienced severe turbulence. This, he noted, could have caused an upset, meaning thrown up and over on its back. That could have induced a high-speed stall, which caused the plane to angle down. Kim also explained that when the DC-4 exited controlled flight, in other words, a stall, it was difficult to get that plane back in complete control in a timely manner. And if the plane was flying at just 3,500 feet, he felt that there would be little distance to pull out of a stall. Based on his analysis of the debris, Kim indicated that the plane hit the water angled down and to the left while flying at about 400 miles per hour. The force of hitting the water at that speed could have made a terrible concussion, and the fuel tanks in the wings could have exploded, creating a fireball. Now, tragically for the passengers of Flight 2501, Kim's scenario means they would have known they were going to die. And a writer, reporter, who had the opportunity to go out and observe the recovery out on the lake, she wrote an article just 4 days after the accident, and she put forth a similar theory, and I want to share that theory with you. Keep in mind the families had not yet been told any of this information, but they read about it in the paper. Here's her article. She wrote, "The 58 persons were buffeted about in the heavens in abject terror before their bodies were chewed to bits as the 4-engine craft smacked in a stone-skipping crash 10 miles west of South Haven. The ill-fated plane flew into a line squall which battered the helpless, out-of-control craft around the skies, blew it miles off course, and undoubtedly jarred its passengers viciously about the inside. For at least 2 minutes, the passengers suffered through a horrible awareness that disaster was near. With terror at its height, then, the big craft plummeted towards the waters, slammed into the lake's surface, and as the plane ripped itself apart, the bodies of its passengers were twisted and torn too." Imagine reading that in the local newspaper. Now, there was one last significant event in the error chain. When 4 other pilots that night chose to turn back and wait out the storm, Captain Robert Lind alone elected to cross Lake Michigan. The reasons for his decision were revealed to me by the nephew of the captain and the wife of the co-pilot, and those decisions would make this a fatal crossing. And so now we have a book that provides the answers, although the search for the wreckage of Flight 2501 hasn't ended. But I received a note from a family member of a Flight 2501 victim after he read the book, and his note convinced me that MSRA and NUMA had already achieved the most important goal. And let me just share his short note with you. George Houston wrote, "This book wonderfully balanced the details, which you and the team exhaustively researched. The carnage with the strings of the heart, the searches in the water and in the archives, the stories of the lives that ended that day, and of those loved ones who's lived on, scarred by the lack of closure. This book provides that closure. My search has ended. It put me softly by Ben and Slava's graveside. It quieted my questions and brought light to calm the dark thoughts of my loved ones' mysterious passings. This book and the untiring efforts to find answers to this fatal crossing honor my grandparents, my family, and me." So I think if nobody else reads the book, the most important folks to read that book are the family members. So with that, I say thank you very much. Thank you. Appreciate it.